Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Safir, and I'm just really honored and excited to spend an hour with you right now amidst everything that's happening in your lives and in the world. And it's a Saturday, and here we are together in community, learning how to be in virtual community together. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. First of all, I'm an author, a coach, and a facilitator. My Twitter handle, if you follow folks on Twitter, is @Safir, and I post lots of good stuff, articles and quotes and such, connections. This quote really hit home for me a couple of weeks ago, and I wanted to start us with this. An article in Teaching Tolerance where the author wrote, "Relationships and well-being can take priority right now over assignments and behavioral compliance." And I've thought about that a lot and kind of marinated on that invitation to what does it mean to really lean into our relationships and our sort of individual and collective well-being in this moment, and to set aside some of the traditional architecture of schooling that we're so used to depending on. I think about that as an educator, and I think about that as a mother as well. So a little bit about my background and family. I'm the mom of these two beautiful babies on the left. My daughter Mona is going into high school and a circus performer, and my son Maximo, an Aikido practitioner, is headed into middle school. So they're at these transitional moments in their schooling amidst a pandemic, which is pretty challenging. My last name, Safir, is a Hebrew and an Arabic word, and in Hebrew it means a scribe, or one who writes for their tribe, and in Arabic it means an ambassador, or one who tries to build bridges across cultures. And so I love and try to live up to both of those meanings, and wrote this book that today's talk is sort of based on, with really both of those concepts in mind. And the lower right, you'll see not just my babies in the middle, but Emily's baby, Ada, on the far right. They're actually cousins. I don't know if folks know that. Our children are cousins. Their fathers are first cousins. And so they adore each other and love to spend time together. And then finally, professionally, I think of myself with multiple identities and hats, probably like many of you, as a teacher, as a former principal, as an equity coach, and as a healer who spent about almost 25 years now in the public education world, in all these different places and spaces, including San Francisco and Oakland, Amman, Jordan, where I taught in an international school. And then now, through my work as an author and a coach and consultant, have the capacity and the privilege of working with folks all over the globe. The work we do as a team is to create brave spaces for equity through story, strategy, and leadership development. So I really feel like we're all learning how to kind of cohabitate and learn together in these virtual spaces. So I think a lot about how do we nurture a safe and healing space when we're in Zoom. So a few guidelines that have served me well is encourage you to use the active speaker view when we're in the large room together, to stay muted until the breakouts, unless Emily wants to unmute you, she's in charge. And please continue to use the chat to surface questions, to surface comments, just to engage. Michael Essien, how exciting. Wonderful to have you here. A colleague of mutual friend Joe Truss. And then some conscious agreements I want to offer are, first and foremost, to really listen, not just with your intellectual self, but with your heart. Listen for heart and meaning. In the breakout spaces, to make space for others who may be shy to come forward, and then to take space if you're not used to doing that. To have grace with yourself and one another. We're all making mistakes as we learn how to navigate this world, and that's okay. Show up and engage. And then finally, pets, kids, photobombs, your humanity, your full self is welcome here. So don't feel bad if something goes awry or somebody flashes in the background. It's all good. It may happen here. I have a puppy downstairs and 2 children. All right. I wanted to take a minute before we dove into some content to actually slow ourselves down. And to do just a moment of mindfulness, if folks would engage with me in that. I'll switch myself to active speaker view. And so I'm going to invite you to maybe pull your chair back just a little bit from your computer, and to maybe lift yourself up and kind of sit again, just connecting to that chair. Place your hands on your thighs. They could be palms up or palms down. And then lift each foot slowly and deliberately, and then place it back on the ground, just feeling your rootedness, feeling your connection to the floor beneath you. And then I want to invite you to close your eyes or find a soft gazing point. Just take a really slow, deep inhale. And on your next inhale, I want you to lift your shoulders up toward your ears. And on the exhale, try to release some of that tension. And then just follow the natural rhythm of your breath in and out. And slowing down the pace at which you're metabolizing this moment, at which you're engaging with this most essential core function of breath. And then I want you to take the next few breaths to just sort of scan your body from the crown of your head, slowly across your neck, your shoulders, across your chest and your abdomen, turning your attention to your lower back and your hips, all the way down through your knees and legs. Paying attention to those calf muscles that keep you walking if you are able, your ankles, your feet, the soles of your feet, your toes. And just notice where you might be carrying tension in your body. Perhaps it's in your forehead. You might unfurrow your brow. Perhaps it's in your jaw. You could loosen your jaw, move it back and forth for a moment. See if with the next couple of breaths you can release by breathing into that tension that you're mindful of now. Take one more slow, deliberate breath. And as you feel ready, you can flutter your eyes open, come back to the room that we're in together. And just take a moment in the chat to note what you noticed. Maybe a feeling you had, a point of tension in your body that came into your awareness, kind of what came up for you as you did that brief mindful meditation. Anybody? Feeling calm for sure. Bonnie noticed a tight jaw. Thank you for the reminder. We carry so much tension in those jaw muscles, clenching, right? To protect ourselves from harm. Left shoulder and neck was tense. And that neck mobility, especially when we're sitting in these Zoom calls all day, it can feel so, physically almost incarcerating. We're just glued to these chairs. Tight shoulders, but then settled. Cynthia's noticing her posture is getting worse sitting at the computer all day for so many hours. Yeah, the 7-8 hours of Zoom calls is killing us. I think we have to learn how to move in these spaces more and more. Rebecca, fingers and hands were tense. I didn't notice that. And Monica says her chest was vibrating tension. What a powerful way to describe that. So I think this piece, when we talk about the pandemic as a trigger for trauma, this piece of mindfulness around how our bodies are metabolizing the moment is so incredibly important. I want to read a quote from a book I'm in the middle of and just absolutely obsessed with. If you haven't gotten your hands on it, there's Emily, my grandmother's hands. So Rizma'a Menachem, I hope I'm saying his name right, is a therapist, a healer, a somatic practitioner, and he writes this: our bodies have a form of knowledge that is different from our cognitive brains. This knowledge is typically experienced as a felt sense of constriction or expansion, pain or ease, energy or numbness. Often this knowledge is stored in our bodies as wordless stories about what is safe and what is dangerous. The body is where we fear, hope, and react, where we constrict and release, and where we reflexively fight, flee, or freeze. If we are to upend the status quo of white body supremacy, we must begin with our bodies. So a quote that I read this morning that made me think about this time we have together and how we can become mindful, both of the universality of this moment and what our bodies are experiencing, but also of the non-universality and the racialized trauma that's happening in very different ways right now for folks across the country and globe. So I want you to think about this image that we're all flooded with so often now, and just notice again, whew, what does that invoke in my body, in my emotions, in my feelings? Just seeing that, knowing all that connects to that one little viral image, what comes up for me? As I said a minute ago, we're having this sort of universal experience of trauma and stress and distress around the coronavirus, but we're also having non-universal experiences. So folks know by now that the disproportionality of death rates with the coronavirus is really extreme. You can see here just from a couple weeks ago in certain counties across the country where the death rate for African American folks is about 3 times higher than the population rate. Similarly, we know that the Navajo Nation and other Native American communities across the country are disproportionately affected through structural racism, through lack of access to quality health care, through the way that implicit bias can play out in the healthcare system. And as well, Michael's in San Francisco. I live across the bay in Oakland. I know there's some other Oakland folks on the phone. This article really struck me from this week about how 90% of people testing positive for COVID-19 in the Mission District in San Francisco had one thing in common. If you didn't read this piece, maybe you can predict. None of them had the privilege of working from home. None of them had the privilege of working from home. So we have a racialized reality, we have a class-based reality, those things often intersect, and yet we also have this universal experience of trauma right now around the pandemic. Something that you probably studied in your course with Emily is this notion from neuroscience that our brains are really hardwired to do 2 things well: to avoid anything that might be perceived as a threat, and to approach anything that might bring us well-being. And the SCARF model, I don't know if you guys have read David Rock's work. He's a social neuroscientist. He talks about how, we're constantly kind of scanning the horizon and looking for ways to minimize threats and maximize well-being in 5 domains. Status, am I valued here? Do I matter here? Many of us are wondering that as our workplaces shift, as our organizational structures shift. Certainty, there's obviously a tremendous amount of uncertainty in the world right now. We don't know if schools are going to open. We don't know when. We don't know if we're safe. We don't know if our families are safe. So the level of activation and social threat is just very steep around certainty. Autonomy, as schools and districts and states and countries put out different policies around all of this, I think educators, counselors, all of us were trying to figure out, well, where do I have choice? Right? And where do I need to follow someone's mandate or directive? And so we're negotiating that, and that can create a high level of social threat. Relatedness is huge. I know raising a teenager right now, I mentioned earlier, my daughter's going into high school. The lack of kind of in-person social engagement and intimacy is incredibly, activates an incredible level of social threat for many of us. I think particularly for teenagers who are developmentally right in that place where all they want is to be with their peers. And then fairness, why is this happening to my family members or my community and not others? Why is there so much inequity in the way this disease is playing out? So all of that's happening, right? And then on a kind of subtle neurological level, and that's, by the way, in page 43 of the book, I should have said that. I'm going to be referencing different pages if folks have this book or they get it, that you can go to for more information about the concepts. We're experiencing this sort of sustained stress, what folks call often the amygdala hijack. So that little kind of almond-shaped organ inside the limbic network of our brain is just in this state of like emotional response that can be, as someone said earlier in the chat, quite overwhelming. Often the amygdala triggers a disproportionate sense of threat, but we might say right now it's not terribly disproportionate, that there's this real active threat in our environment all the time. And so what do we do with that? Lots of things, right? We might engage in fight behaviors. We might engage in flight. UCLA researchers found another stress paradigm that was common in women called tend and befriend. We might try to care for others, making food for people, volunteering in the community, or befriend by forming kind of alliances. And we might also do like what a possum does and just that faint or that freeze, right? Where we actually just can't even move. There's a sense of paralysis in the face of all of this. So we're experiencing this universal moment. There's a non-universal sort of racialized and class-based dynamic to it. And then we're all metabolizing it in different ways, right? And so you might look at this and just think for a minute, where do I see myself in these in the 4 quadrants or the middle? Like, what am I noticing about my own responses to threat right now? Am I engaging in fight behaviors, flight? Am I leaning toward tend and befriend? Am I sometimes feeling just paralyzed by what's happening right now? So I want to connect this more directly to schools and say that under this level of stress, we often return to what's familiar. So there's a pull toward grading, task orientation, toward teaching and instruction and online communities, right? Toward compliance, toward giving a lot of directives because we're trying to like find order in the chaos. And so I invite you to think of Neo, if you've seen The Matrix, and this invitation to slow down and be extremely mindful about how we're moving through the work right now. And if we hold that lens and we think about that opening quote about how relationships and well-being can take priority over assignments and compliance, we might think about the importance of listening right now deeply to one another, of cultivating voice in our students and in our colleagues and in our communities and families, of taking more of a coaching stance maybe rather than an instructional stance in the work we do, of building trust, and of prioritizing dialogue over directives. So I want to leave you with one more model to think about. I know some of you are familiar with this model. I wrote about it in my book, and a lot of people use this in the work. And then I'll give you a chance to go into breakouts of maybe 4 people or so and just have some conversation about what I've been sharing. So the 6 circle model is this sort of model of a living system, a living, breathing, dynamic organism, which is what we all live inside of. And the authors of this, Margaret Wheatley and Tim Dalmau, teach us that the problems and the solutions to our current challenges have both technical dimensions and relational dimensions. So the technical dimensions they call the above the green line, the sort of structures and patterns and processes we put in place. And most organizations pay a lot of attention to those, right? So we'll look at examples in a minute. But they say equally important but often undernourished are the below the green line dimensions of a living system, which is the quality of our relationships, our sense of identity or purpose in the work we do, and the sort of fluidity with which information flows in the system. Let's talk about how that looks in the moment we're in. That's on page 86 of the book. I want to offer the idea that how we show up in this moment with each other matters at least as much as what we do. So above the green line, you may be involved in a district or a nonprofit organization or a system that's thinking a lot about what's our distance learning schedule look like, how are we going to get laptops out to kids, how are we going to feed people, what's our virtual PD structure, all kind of above the green line structures and processes that matter. We have to have that sense of organization right now. But equally important is how are we listening deeply to our colleagues? What are the core values and principles that are going to guide us through this moment so that we don't replicate the status quo within virtual spaces, but rather hopefully begin to come to a place of transformation and reimagination of what's possible? And how do we attend to educators shifting identity in this moment? I think about this a lot. I'm married to a teacher in Oakland Unified, and it's really palpable to see what educators are going through right now at different levels of the system as they're stripped away from the work and the communities and the young people that they care about, really attending to what that feels like and the level of loss implicit in that. We think about, again, for identity, the loss of teacher or principal identity or the way you've been in that role is obviously changing right now. We may be struggling to find purpose. We might be implementing a lot of responsive things in our communities and schools, but lacking kind of a shared vision and values for what this is all about. In our relationships, again, we may lose interpersonal connection. We're certainly losing physical touch with friends. My daughter talks about how sad it is to not be able to hug her friends. That's a particular piece of trauma for her right now that she's really struggling with. And in terms of information, we have these virtual platforms and we're learning how to navigate them, but they're constricting in some ways, right? We don't have the subtle cues, the sort of nonverbal communication that we might have when we're face to face. And there's a level of sort of psychic and cognitive stress that can come from being in this platform all day long together. And so patterns we may be seeing or experiencing ourselves, depression, anxiety, non-compliance, and creative resistance, right? I'm not going to do that assignment. I'm not going to go to that PD. I'm not going to show up for that meeting. These are ways that we're coping and trying to make sense of the world that we're in right now. Lots of ways we can approach this that are more humanizing, small, some big. So I brought you some conscious agreements at the beginning of today. I think it's really important that we have agreements for how we enter and engage in virtual spaces together. We're going to do a listening dyad a little bit later after the breakout session. So this is a structure above the green line, but that nurtures the below the green line dimensions. One-on-ones with colleagues, wellness checks, so important. I bet a lot of you are doing this already. I put on Twitter yesterday a video interview with the principal and AP of a school in San Francisco, June Jordan, that I used to run. And they're doing little like bi-weekly check-ins with each adult in their community, and they're finding it to be incredibly powerful and important. Ritualizing small group sharing circles, leveraging the breakout rooms, which we're about to go into, using those Google Classroom question boxes, listening campaigns with the most vulnerable. I could do an entire hour just on that, but so important that we get out there and find the students who are least connected to our schools right now and listen and hear what they're experiencing, what they want and need. Bi-weekly community surveys and pulse checks just to figure out what's happening for folks. And generally just how do we activate a sense of agency in our students and colleagues in a moment that feels so anti-agentic in a way, that feels so disempowering in a way? How do we help people figure out what they want and need and where they want to direct their energy in their learning? And that includes students. I'm a big champion of doing more self-directed inquiry and project-based learning right now with young people. All right, lots to think about. Let's put you into breakout rooms. Emily, if you could do that, random is fine, about maybe 4 people per room. And just simple question, I want to give you each about 1.5 minutes to share what resonates from these ideas I put forward and what connections or questions are bubbling up for you. All right?
Okay, I'm going to put people in breakout rooms. Thanks, Shane.
So wanted to kind of close this time with a little bit of practice around the skill of deep listening that sounds, I think, a lot simpler than it is. And begin that section with the words of writer and thinker Rachel Naomi Remen, who says, when you listen generously to people, they can hear the truth in themselves, often for the first time. And so I invite you to think about what it looks like for you to listen generously to other people and sort of gift folks with that quality attention and care and love in this moment. One of the things I talk about often is that, you know, we listen all the time. I think especially as educators, we spend a lot of our workday listening. They say that about half of a typical workday across professions is spent listening. Most of our awake time, we're engaged in some form of communication. And of course, listening is the primary modality through which we come to know what we know. I wonder if you all could guess in the chat what percentage of professionals you think have been trained in how to listen well. Emily says 5%, okay. Bonnie says 15, 10, okay, we're pretty skeptical in the 5 to 15% range. So what the research showed, as I was writing the listening leader, is that less than 2% of professionals receive training in how to listen well. And yet here we are engaged in this really complex act throughout most of our workday. So I find it valuable to slow down and to actually practice what this is like. We're going to practice briefly one listening dyad, which is a form of constructivist listening. Folks who know this practice know that it's really the purpose is about being able to construct new insight or knowledge for ourselves, similar to constructivist pedagogy, and that it's not very different from typical listening where we're often listening with our own agenda or for something that we can get out of it. In this case, we're listening for the benefit of the speaker. And we're doing that with the principle of reciprocity, that I agree to listen to and care for you in exchange for you doing the same for me. And there's 4 simple guidelines. You'll be in one more breakout room with one partner this time. You'll each have about 1.5 minutes to talk, so equal time to that point that Monica just made, that everyone deserves a voice. And often even our virtual spaces replicate inequity of voice, right? Where some folks are holding space and taking space more than others. So this process, this protocol structures against that. We don't interrupt or advise in this structure, with the core belief there that people have the capacity to solve their own problems if we give them space and time to reflect. We hold confidentiality so folks can be authentic, and we don't criticize or complain about mutual colleagues as we share. It's hard to listen well if you think that you might be attacked in a future setting like this. So those are our guidelines. Your prompt is going to be, when is the last time you felt deeply listened to, and how did that feel? And you'll just have about 1.5 minutes each to practice this. I want you to really notice what it feels like to hold space for the other person and listen without responding, and then notice how it feels to share on the other side. Okay, Emily, if you could put folks into a quick, 4-minute, 1.5 minutes each breakout room. First, wondering if you noticed your nonverbal cues and how you're navigating those in this virtual space. That's something I mentioned earlier that I think is really challenging. So you'll notice in this graphic from the researcher Robert Merabian, that's in chapter 5 of the book, that only about when we're engaged in a communication that has any emotion at play in it, only about 7% of that communication comes down to the spoken word. Over half is about our nonverbal cues, right? What we're conveying through our face, our body language, our, the way we're standing or sitting, and 38% is our tone. So it's something I invite you to be mindful about as you work with colleagues and with students in the next few months, or as long as we're in this space, is, we don't have as much data, nonverbal data and tonal data as we normally do. And so how do we try to enrich meaning and understanding even in these spaces? The listening stances in chapter 5 of the book, hopefully you felt some of that attention to nonverbal cues, the mature empathy of being able to stand in somebody else's struggle or what they're working through, and just not try to fix it for them, but hold space for them. And then finally, the affirmation stance of how we can listen in ways that affirm, as many of you said, that kind of validate the humanity and the kind of core goodness of each of us. Listening, I like to say, builds relational capital. It's one of our most powerful strategies always as leaders, and I think even more so in this pandemic moment. We're making deposits every time we listen, every time we hold space for somebody, so that if we need a person to take a risk with us or to show up and lead with us, we have something to withdraw. We're not drawing on an empty bank account. So to close this out, I just want to give a few invitations to you for the COVID moment. First, to just continue to take care of yourselves so that you are available to others. Michael had a really powerful comment around that earlier before he went into the dyads around the duality of this situation. How do we support educators to remain connected to their own humanity as they provide service to students and families and try to address their own needs during this pandemic? And that's incredibly challenging right now, right? We're all navigating self and other. And I do think that making space and time every day for the self-nurturing is going to allow us to be more of service as educators, which is such a demanding job. Stay connected to your colleagues as much as you can. Try not to silo. It's so easy to be siloed right now. Trust each other. And as I said earlier, give each other grace as we all learn how to do this together. It's hard, it's challenging, it's unprecedented. Online visibility, I think, can feel vulnerable, so I try not to force it with students or with adults. If people don't want their camera on, for young people, it can feel very exposing to have their home space seen. And so as much as possible, I think we need to give agency to the learner or the colleague around that. Maximize student and colleague voice and choice as much as possible. And then remember, as author Glennon Doyle, who I adore, says, this is hard and we can do hard things. We are doing this together. We're figuring this out together, day by day, Zoominar by Zoominar, meeting by meeting, conversation by conversation. I think instead of this, I'm going to open it up to questions, and then I'll close with a quote. So any questions or reactions people want to share before we move to the real final closing?
Yeah, you can put your hands up. I think everybody can unmute themselves if they have a question.
I've just a quick comment. I really enjoyed and appreciated this format of getting some information discussing with a small group, getting some more information, practicing it with a partner. I think that it's the kind of thing that we would more likely, like when you do an in-person workshop, you do more of that. And it seems like, at least like for my staff meetings and stuff, which usually would be like that, it's just like sit and listen to an administrator once in the Zoom. And I appreciate that more sort of interpersonal connecting in smaller groups format, even though we're doing this virtually. That helped me a lot.
Thank you, Monica. I think it's really important that we push our practice in this, in this virtual world, that we're not just sitting and getting, that we're not just replicating what I call like a pedagogy of compliance, right? But we're still really trying to center student voice and colleague voice and humanizing interactions with one another. So thank you for acknowledging that. Other questions or comments?
Well, the comment that you touched on that Michael had made, that it's so essential to be taking care of ourselves in this time as educators. It's almost like in this new world, that should be part of our job description. It's been such an assumed part of the role that, yes, you have to have self-care in order to be present and emotionally responsive to our students, but maybe that should become a description in the job description of our responsibility. But yeah.
I love that idea.
Yeah. I want to appreciate the modeling that you did in this presentation today, in terms of being very explicit about slowing down, engaging in the norms, and saying it's okay if kids run through, like we're in like a different time, and acknowledging the challenging situations that we're in. So as I was looking at the moves, like I was thinking about some of the meetings that I've held as a principal, and maybe some tweaks, some changes. So I do want to appreciate the modeling that you shared today. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. It means a lot coming from such an esteemed leader right here in my neighboring community. Thank you for that. Time for maybe one more.
It could be related to this, or it could be a question for Shane in any capacity for the work she's doing as a trainer and educator.
Shane, I just really appreciate your whole list of humanizing approaches. I really hope that we can intentionally re-enter our students into school, especially if we have half days. It's hard for me as a new person in a district to coach friends and colleagues and educators into the importance of not cramming content down throats, but how do we really ritualize our small group sharing and build connectivity for our kiddos so that they get what they need, and we don't push them away. So thank you for that list. You put words to all of my thoughts, and I just appreciate what you're sharing with us.
Thank you so much, Meryl. I've been thinking about this a lot because I feel like, at least in California, there's sort of this vacuum when it comes to what it's going to look like to go back to school. Like there's such an absence of information, and I would say an absence of vision so far around what it could look like. And I think in the absence of vision, then we often default back to business as usual, right? And status quo. And I've been doing a lot of research for my second book right now about with Indigenous scholars, a book called Decolonizing Our Methodologies, and other work from Indigenous folks around the globe. And there's a concept of holism that you guys may have studied in your program around attending to the integration of the emotion, the spirit, the body, and the mind. And I think that we could do well to listen to Indigenous scholars and leaders right now as we think about the fall and what it could look like to create a framework that is truly a whole child framework that brings us back together in a way that's not transactional and that's not task oriented, but that's actually deeply humanizing and holistic. I think there's a lot of really powerful work out there that we could draw on from folks around the globe. So that's something I've been thinking about a lot.
Thank you. I think that's a good call to action for us all as we see like who's informing the future of education right now, like the committee that was formed in New York. It was not psychologists, it was not humanists, it was technologists. And so for all of us on this call, that message is valid, and what we want to have happen for education is valid, and we should get our voices out there in any way we can. So thank you so much, Shane, for your time. It was so valuable, such an honor. So
Thank you. I've enjoyed being with you all, and with the words of Mr. Menachem, who is a therapist, right, and a healer. And I just love this quote. He says, "Years as a healer and trauma therapist have taught me that trauma isn't destiny. The body, not the thinking brain, is where we experience most of our pain, pleasure, and joy, and where we process most of what happens to us. It is also where we do most of our healing and where we experience resilience and a sense of flow." So it is Saturday, hopefully wherever you are on the globe. I don't know about Australia, but I invite you to go out and find some space for your, body and your joy and your resilience and your connection and that sense of flow, so that you're able to be of service to those in your community when we come back next week. And thank you all so much for being with me this hour.
Thank you, Shane.
Yeah. Oh, I forgot to mention, we do have a summer institute. My colleague Jamila and I are doing this in June 22nd, 23rd. And if you want to join us, I'll put my website in the chat. You can just sign up on there.